Of course.
Yeah, thanks.
You happy with the sound quality from the Chancellor? Okay. Okay, Chair, we're ready here, so if you want to give the countdown, that's great.
Okay, great. We'll go. Okay. So 5, 4. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Treasury Select Committee and our evidence session on the recent budget. We're delighted to be joined by the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who is also supported by Dan York-Smith. I don't think, Chancellor, we require you to introduce yourself, but perhaps, Dan, you might very briefly introduce yourself to the committee, please.
Yeah, I'm Dan York-Smith. I'm the Director of Strategy, Planning and Budget with overall responsibility for the budget.
Great. Well, thank you very much to both of you for appearing this afternoon. And I think, Chancellor, we have you until 4:30. So we have a couple of hours to get through our questions. Could I start, Chancellor, by asking you this? So assuming that the epidemiological risks dissipate as we hope they will, so that we don't have a virulent return of the virus or some strain that evades the vaccines, etc. What do you think, in the absence of that, would be the top two key risks to the public finances and the recent forecast around the budget over the forecast period?
Well, I think that the forecasts, Chair, already take the roadmap as their base case assumption. So they assume that you do get the virus receding and it's controlled and the restrictions taper off during the course of the year, as I think the OBR explained how they did that and were aided by the roadmap being published, obviously, in good time beforehand. So that's already in there. But I guess, even though the restrictions tail off, the impact of coronavirus on the economy and the public finances lasts for well beyond that period. You would have seen the OBR's analysis, their assumption of the scarring impact, 3% over the medium term. That number is obviously uncertain, and there are people who think it could be lower, people who think it could be higher. So that's probably the one number that has the biggest impact on the medium term outlook for the economy and the public finances.
So I suppose if I rephrase my question, if it doesn't go to plan and the forecast comes in looking rather uglier than is hoped, what are the parts of that forecast that you think will have been found wanting?
Well, I think I'll probably just stick to the base case, right? There are lots of things that, so there's downside risks, there's upside risks. I think mainly those will come in the short term from the epidemiological outlook, and I think the impact that has on the medium term productive capacity of the economy. I think it's fair to say economists are uncertain about exactly what that impact will be, and that remains, I think, the single biggest driver over time of whether things are better or worse than expected. I think the exact shape or the exact pace of the recovery, plus or minus 3 months, it's hard to know. But I think that is a more fundamental impact medium term.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, when you lose a bit of sleep at night, and I'm sure you do occasionally over the economy, I think we all do. And you mentioned downside risks. What are the downside risks that you particularly worry about?
Well, I think that's the economic impact. Are you saying what are the downside risks, even if the base case epidemiological assumptions hold true, or the downside risks?
Yes,
if that turns out not to be the case.
No, if the base case is currently cast around the roadmap comes to pass,
right? Yeah, beyond that,
beyond that, exactly.
Yeah, well, I think the 3% assumption, even in the base case, there are respected economic commentators who think that could be worse. For example, the IMF being a notable one. So even if the roadmap comes to pass, but it turns out that the medium-term scarring impacts are worse than feared, then that would be of concern, because that is a very significant impact on the economy. And obviously, the exact path of the labour market is one that I'm constantly kept up at night by. Our ability, sadly, 750,000 people have already lost their jobs, and more are forecast to do so. That were a lot better than was forecast a year ago in the summer of last year. So in one sense, that's positive news. And again, this forecast talked about that and the improvements in the labour market forecast as a result of the interventions and other things. But fundamentally, that's a large number of people who are going to lose their jobs over the course of this pandemic, and minimising the number of those unemployed and finding them new opportunities as quickly as possible is the thing that keeps me up at night. And as I've spoken about, and as the OBR report highlighted, from a fiscal perspective, the public finances are much more sensitive to changes in interest rates and inflation than they were previously, and especially given that interest rates are or have been exceptionally low, they could rise to what would be still historically very low levels, and that would have a significant impact, as the OBR show, on public finances over the next few years.
So, Chancellor, thank you. So you've touched there on interest rates, which I think is an absolutely correct thing to think about. So we even know that since the closing of the OBR's forecast, a 30 basis points increase in interest rates has already led to an additional
£6 billion, yeah.
£6 billion extra, which in fact, in terms of the forecast, I think reduces all the headroom that there is in the forecast for debt to be coming down in the latter part of the forecast as a percentage of GDP. So that sensitivity is very strong. What do you think? What are the risks around that? What are the things in your view that might drive rates going up, other than, for example, stonking levels of growth, in which case we're rather less worried about it? But if we're stuck in sort of the sort of forecast territory on growth, interest rates are beginning to spark up. What's causing that, and what is the sort of plan around that, if any?
So I think my own investing career tells me to be probably not that, I guess, high confidence about macroeconomic forecasting with regard to what global bond investors will price credit at. But I think the point one would make is they are exceptionally low. And even though there are arguments for structurally lower interest rates, as articulated by people like Larry Summers, Jason Furman, Olivier Blanchard, and others, that was the case a while ago, and they could still return to those still very low levels off this low base. And that would just be a return to the new normal as opposed to a fundamental change. Obviously, if people's inflation expectations change, that is also a driver of interest rate expectations. And thankfully, because of our robust independent framework that we have, I think inflation expectations here remain well anchored, which is good. And in terms of how do we address that, what we try and do is manage our financing in a way that is most supportive of insulating us against that risk. Historically, and I can't take any credit for this because it came before my time, previous chancellors have succeeded in pushing out the maturity of our debt. So on average, it's kind of double digit, 12, 13, 14 years. The G7 average is about half that. That helps. That is partially, though, offset, as the OBR, I think, had a box explaining, that is partly offset by the impact of quantitative easing and the asset purchase facility, but also we actually have more inflation-linked debt than most of our peers. But we published a new remit for the Debt Management Office alongside budget, which shows a desire to do as much financing as we can at the long end of the curve, and more than we have done historically.
And just on that, we included some analysis in the Red Book on pages 26 and 27 about the potential implications of a shift in interest rates for inflation expectations and the debt interest burden, and mirrored by.
Can I move on? Thank you for that. Sticking with inflation just for a moment. So we don't know how the supply side is going to respond exactly as we come out of this, with various uncertainties around that. Equally around the demand side, not least how people are going to engage with the economy now, and what's going to happen to all this enforced savings people have undertaken in the interim, and so on. What if a scenario emerges where inflationary pressures start to build under that scenario? In other words, demand is getting to be a bit too much, or perhaps stimulus is a little bit too low. What kind of tools and things? What is your thinking around that? Do you have at your disposal the kind of tools and levers you might be able to pull in a fairly nimble way to try and get that sort of emergence of the economy right in terms of trying to avoid inflationary pressures?
Well, I think it probably wouldn't be right for me to speculate on hypothetical future policy, Chair, but with regard to inflation, obviously we have an independent Bank of England who have a remit to manage price stability. They also have, in contrast to some other regimes when they were constructed, flexibility around how they interpret that to balance the various priorities that they have. But obviously that is first and foremost a job for our independent Bank of England.
I was probably trying to draw you more into fiscal policy, but I take the point as to what you may not be able to say on that. Can I just touch on one final thing? If I was where you're sitting now, the answer to my initial question would have been, I'm very worried about how realistic the spending figures are in the forecast. I'd be worrying that there's no explicit provision for coronavirus spending on annual vaccinations beyond the current program Test and Trace. I'd be worried about the backlog in hospitals and for operations and procedures and growing. I'd be worried about the nurses' pay round and the issues around that. I'd be worried about education and that budget and all the children that need presumably more resources there to catch up the lost learning. I'd be worried about the railways, which are substantially state-owned and may well need significant bailouts in the future. I'd be worried about pressures for further extension of the UC uplift in due course. And that's even before I got on to worrying about the social care issue and the kind of demographic pressures there are building up as we go through time. Is it just not the case that the kind of numbers you've got in there and spending are unrealistic and are just going to come under unbearable pressure over the coming spending round and the years ahead?
Well, I think on public spending, what you've seen since the start of this Parliament and this government is a significant uplift in public spending. So between over the two first years, this current year and next year, there's about a £70 billion increase in public spending across RDEL and CDEL, so across all kind of discretionary expenditure for departments. That's a historically very strong uplift, about 6% nominal over those 2 years from memory.
8% nominal and 5% in real.
So, and then if you look at the forecast, so you're starting from a base that is significantly increased on where it was, and the forecast for future spending growth that are contained, which are assumptions, mechanically the same assumptions as we've held previously at 2.1% real in aggregate for the rest of the Parliament. What that would tell you for the Parliament is that spending growth of around 3.5% real over the course of the Parliament. That is very healthy spending overall by any historic sense, and obviously significantly ahead of economic growth over that period, and leaves the size of the state at the end of the Parliament at a level that we haven't seen in quite a while. So that the government, the state, will be spending historically very large amounts of money, both in terms of growth rates and as a percentage of GDP by the end of the Parliament. But how that is allocated is obviously a function of spending reviews.
What happens to departmental resource spending from 2022-23 onwards?
The back end assumption, hang on, I've got it. Over the course of the Parliament, it will be 3.4%, I think. And it's 2.1% real is what's in the budget book from memory.
Yeah,
I think it's a cut of 15 billion, isn't it?
No, it's you're asking what the spending growth rate is. I think sometimes
I'm asking what the cut in spending is, and I think it's 15 billion.
No, spending grows over the Parliament and grows in every year. So I think what you're referring to are changes in forecasts from previous fiscal events. That's not a cut in spending. spending is growing over this Parliament very strongly. It will start about 414 billion or 412 billion pounds at the beginning, and will end up about 100 billion pounds greater than that by the end. The real growth rate that implies for the Parliament is about 3.4%. Again, that's a historically high real rate of growth in public spending, greater than economic growth, and leaves the size of the state as a percentage of GDP at levels that we haven't seen for quite a while. So I think any which way you look at it, that's a significant amount of public spending.
But the way I'm looking at it is, it seems to me there's a 15 billion cut relative to previous plans from 2022-23 in the face of all the additional spending pressures you're likely to face, which I went through earlier. And I would have thought that would have been one of the areas where, in terms of the sleepless night analogy, if you like, you would have been worrying quite a bit about that.
Well, I think with your question, I felt more was about exogenous factors that might happen to us. Obviously, spending is something that is within the government's control in that sense. And I'm comfortable that the spending assumptions contained would represent historically high growth rates in spending in excess of economic growth, which fundamentally is a good measure of what we can afford to spend. And if you look at where the state is, the size of the state, that's quite chunky by historic standards. Now, look, spending reviews are always times where we have choices. Governments have to make choices, and we have to have priorities. It was ever thus, and it will be the case going forward. That's the nature of it. All governments have to prioritise within a pie. The good news is the pie is growing at a rapid rate over the course of this Parliament, and relative to the size of our economy is a large pie.
Okay, I'll wager with you now that those spending numbers are going to come under inordinate pressure over the coming years, but perhaps we'll have a pint of beer on it one way or the other, Chancellor. But thank you very much. That's my questions. I'm now going to go to Felicity, if I may, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and it's great to see you both. My questions are on the state of the economy and of public finances. So let me go back to the OBR forecast of 3% scarring. Can you set out what the budget does to address that scarring, and does the budget do enough? And as a supplementary question, you alluded to the fact that there are some estimates that are worse than 3%. If we do find ourselves in that situation, what tools does Treasury have? I'm not asking you to predict future fiscal policy, but what tools do you have to address more scarring?
So, Felicity, this is the first part of your question. What does a budget do? The OBR made a decision not to change their medium-term view of scarring, and I think they explained that in the narrative, and I think they've probably talked to you about it. That was just a choice they made at this event, given the timetable. It's something they'll come back to. So they've just retained the assumption that they had at the beginning, I think. And look, some things have changed in one direction, some things have changed in another direction since then. I think it's a really uncertain number. So the Bank of England, I think, for example, think it could be less than that. I think 1.75% was the last assumption they have. The OBR the IMF have a range that is up to potentially 5 or 6%. There are different components of the scarring impact, and I think that's the other challenge. And I think the OBR talked about 3, but there's an impact on labour market, and then there's an impact on capital, of the two that I would probably think about. Then there's a general total productivity impact as well. Now, what we don't know, Felicity, is the exact mix of those, how it's going to be impacted. This is quite unlike a typical recession. In the 1980s, for example, there was an enormous amount of capital scrappage and very specialised, higher skill, higher wage work that was displaced as a result of some of the changes in the that had quite significant medium-term impacts. The nature of this shock is very different to that. The industries that are most affected are not capital intensive. You think about hospitality being an example, and the labour is of a different type, where it's probably much more easy for people to adjust and move professions. So those are arguments for why the scarring might be lower. I think what can we do? What we can do is try and hold as much of the economy's productive capacity together as we can through the crisis. That's the best way to limit the long-term damage. So it's try and keep that unemployment number as low as possible and also limit the amount of business insolvencies. That's what creates the scarring, is if we lose that productive capacity, the attachment of workers to firms, if those disappear, and that's what takes time to rebuild, and people, sometimes that doesn't happen, and that's what leads to the scarring impact. So all our interventions, notably furlough being an obvious example, but also the business support measures, attempt to do that. They help businesses get through a period of disruption, but still be there at the other end and attach their labour force attached to those workplaces. That's the economic rationale for the policies. And if we can do that, when they reopen and then they bounce back to life as they were, then we've minimised the scarring in the long term. So that's been the thesis of our policies and the analysis underpinning them. But it is given the nature of this shock, I think it's fair to say no one has high precision on the exact degree of scarring there will be.
Thank you. Let me just pick up on the Labour point. There has been talk that 600,000 people may have left London and that you may have seen a lot of immigrants return to their countries of origin. Do you think that is the case, and are you concerned about that?
Yeah, obviously, I've just seen the articles that have been written by others. Obviously, there's nothing in our data as such that would allow us to make that to make that determination. But there is, I think, further work that the ONS are interested in doing, and it might be that they would like to use some of the data that we hold within Treasury and HMRC and others to help them do that, and that's the kind of active conversation that we're having.
Now, we've clearly had an extended period of relatively low growth and productivity. You're obviously looking to address that, in particular with the super deduction. But are you concerned that if we accelerate the investment to now, then in 2 years' time, especially with higher corporation taxes, that may be a very difficult period if so much of the business investment has been accelerated?
Well, Felicity, I think you have a choice in all of these situations. Is you do actively want to bring forward investment, right? And it's about minimising the scarring. The growth is slightly more valuable to us now when the economy really needs to close an output gap than it is in 2 years' time. So whether it's, for example, a stamp duty cut or the super deduction, they are policies that are designed to, ideally both bring forward economic activity, but also increase the amount of economic activity above what would otherwise have happened. And there's always going to be a mix of those two impacts in these policies. But it is a deliberate policy aim to bring forward investment. We need to drive an investment-led recovery. As we saw over the last year, consumption, it seems like we didn't know at the time, but consumption, it looks like, can and will spring back reasonably quickly once things are reopened, and you've seen all the commentary around excess savings in aggregate across the economy, and the OBR made an assumption about how much of that gets deployed. For example, on the investment side, we've had perennially a difficult time with raising capital investment. We know there is excess capital sitting on corporate bank balances as well. We want to unlock some of that, use that to help drive the recovery, which is why the super deduction and others are so helpful.
Thank you. And do you think that 2 years before we go into the consolidation phase is the right period of time? Or do you think that the economy potentially needs more time for growth really to bed in?
I think, well, we were trying to balance with significant capital investment. You need to have enough time that people can do the planning that is required to make those large investments. So often people have done things like this for a year. We felt 2 years struck the right balance between it needs to be long enough that people have the time they need to make the plans and do the investments of that nature, but not so long that it loses the impact you want of bringing forward activity and creating a sense of urgency around the attractive situation that is presented to companies. We think 2 years strikes the right balance for that. And then in terms of the, how does that dovetail with what's going on in the economy? You would have seen from the OBR an expectation that pre-crisis GDP is going to happen in Q2 next year. So that's a full year before the next phase of the fiscal plan. The Bank of England thinks that could happen in Q1 of next year. So I think that there's a reasonable degree of cushion between that and when the super deduction ends.
It's also at the point, sorry, I was just going to add, it's also at the point at which the OBR judged that the output gap is effectively closed. And just on this point, it's also part of the reason for the generosity. So the last time we did a sort of widely available first year allowance in 2009, the super deduction is 5 times more generous at its peak and 10 times more generous in total. So it's a very big intervention also for that reason.
Thank you. And let me just go back to your comment on household savings. I know it's estimated that almost as much as 180 billion could have been accumulated. Now, the OBR is forecasting that to be spent at a rate of 5% per year. Could you look to bring that spending forward to incentivize that?
It's not something. It's not something we actively looked at for this budget. I think it's. You make an interesting point, and you're right about the OBR's assumption is that that's as it is, and we'll have a sense of that, I guess, actually once things are reopened, because we'll be able to measure what's happening with with consumption. So I think what we saw last time around, which was unclear because there was an enormous worry that actually when things reopened last year, that people wouldn't have the confidence to spend, even though they had the income to, and we saw consumer confidence numbers back then were very bad. I think there was more an argument to being worried about that then. I think this time around, both in the UK and internationally, we've seen that you do tend to get quite a strong consumption recovery automatically.
And I think other forecasters, so I think the Bank of England is forecasting a quicker spending of the savings that people have accrued. And it's one of the things that the OBR have described as an upside risk for their forecast. So if people are more confident as the vaccine rollout continues successfully and things open up and they spend at a quicker rate, it could actually, there could be an even greater boost to growth later in this year. And I think in total, they already have increased significantly the level of GDP for this year as a result of the roadmap and the government's policies. So they're expecting it to be three quarters of a percent bigger over the spring and summer of this year after the policy measures than before. So there is already, the combination of government policy is quite supportive of consumption because it's about the confidence on the labour market side, as well as the reopening.
I'm being told I've just got time for one more question, so let me make that on the public finances. So the OBR forecast does have debt to GDP coming off in the last few years. However, that's clearly subject to a lot of risks. I guess two questions. One is there a level of debt to GDP that you would think is just unacceptable? And clearly, we've got a big buyer of public debt at the moment in the Bank of England through quantitative easing. Are you concerned that if inflation does become an issue, then you do not have that quantitative easing and that effective buyer of gilts?
Firstly, I can't comment on the QE and the conduct of monetary policy. So that's that. And your first question around debt levels, I'd say, look, we deliberately at this budget didn't think it was appropriate to set firm fiscal rules with precise targets and timeframes, given the level of uncertainty. You're right, the forecasts as they are show debt very, very slightly coming off at the back end. But again, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty at the moment, so I wouldn't read too much into that. But I think it shows that the steps we've taken do put the public finances on a much more sustainable footing, subject to, obviously, as we've been talking about, the forecasting uncertainty. And I think it's harder to be precise about an absolute debt level. Obviously, you all know, there was a historic convention around the 90%, which was based on a Reinhardt and Rogoff study, and then clarified. I mean, that was written obviously at a time of slightly higher interest rates. I think focusing on affordability is important. I set out some principles in the budget speech that we think about, not borrowing for day-to-day spending, making sure that, debt over time is on a falling trajectory, and having regard to the affordability of that debt, given the sensitivity we have, and then using fiscal space as it exists for long-term productive capital investment. I think those are the principles that I think about rather than one absolute debt level. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chancellor, for your time today. My questions are on the fiscal side, really following up some of the questions that Felicity asked. When the government, after the financial crisis, needed to close the fiscal gap, it relied heavily on spending cuts, 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises. The Office of Budget Responsibility told us that this time round, the last 2 years of your consolidation, it's 60% tax rises and 40% spending cuts, almost the mirror image of last time round. I'm just wondering, what is the economic rationale behind doing it that way and relying more on tax rises and spending cuts?
Well, I think to go to the question before, and Anthony, it was making sure that we could deliver our commitments to invest strongly in public services, whether that is 50,000 more nurses, 20,000 more police officers, more hospitals, and to invest in infrastructure around the country to spread opportunity. Those were all important commitments, and we wanted to deliver on all of those, and that required the approach that we took.
You mentioned in answer to a question earlier that we have a very big pie now, that the size of the state is the largest for some time to come, and the OBR in its report points out that at the end of your forecast year 24-25, the tax rises to 35% of GDP, which is the highest since 1969 when Roy Jenkins was Chancellor. Is this a new permanent state of affairs? Should we get used to the idea that we've got a bigger state and bigger permanent level of higher taxation, or will it come down again?
Well, I think, obviously, the government has to raise the money to fund the public services that it is committed to delivering. So those two things always have to be in sync. And, if there are demands on the spending side that are larger, it's reasonable to expect that those have to be paid for. I think I think most people would understand that. And that's what the forecasts reflect. They reflect a larger amount of public spending than historically financed, as governments do finance it, largely by taxation and then borrowing, getting to sustainable levels.
You mentioned your 3 fiscal principles that in your comments earlier, and also in your budget speech, to stabilise the debt, which I think you can say, tick, you're doing that in 2 years' time, and to not to borrow for day-to-day spending, which I think, by my assessment, I think you achieved that by the end of the cycle, and then obviously now is a good time to borrow for investment. So they're sound principles. You said now is not the right time to have new fiscal rules that the OBR can score you against. When would be the right time? And are you thinking about it now? When could we expect it? And do you have any thoughts of the guiding principles above and beyond what you've said at the moment?
No. I think Anthony, once we have a bit more certainty about the medium-term outlook, would be the appropriate time. I mean, that might be towards the end of this year, all being well, but I wouldn't want to 100% guarantee that. We're obviously dealing at a time of heightened uncertainty, and hopefully those principles are they're broad, but I think give you a good sense of what one might want to do. I mean, the precision with which you operationalise them, different people will have different points of view on. But as a general rule, not borrowing for day-to-day spending is a widely accepted, easily understood. None of these things are perfect, but it's a pretty decent approach to fiscal policy that has broad support. And then there are questions over, do you define that precisely to the pound? Do you have buffers that allow a bit of a give or take? Is it over what time period, et cetera, cyclically adjusted? But broadly, as a principle, I think that's widely accepted. And then debt being stable to declining again, broadly straightforward. It's just a question of, again, what kind of time period, what kind of trajectory would you like to see? Affordability of debt is the one which is, I guess, more relevant now than it has been in the past, because interest rates are so low. And to the Chair's question earlier, one needs to be mindful of the potential impact on the public finances if that changes, and one needs to be looking forward about, okay, if rates are moving now, that has an impact to me over time, and I need to be thinking about that, and operationalizing that is probably a bit trickier, and we haven't, I don't think, had a formal fiscal rule that has done that. Well, certainly not in a while, I don't think. So thinking about how to define that is a bit trickier, but it should be part of the equation.
I mean, you're absolutely right that obviously what ultimately matters is the affordability of it. But we don't actually, the government only has limited control over that in terms of long-term interest rates. And so it's something slightly outside your scope to manage. I'm just wondering, Felicity asked about the level of debt, and Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, he did have a target for level of debt of 40% of GDP, and he measured it every year, whether it was like 1% below that or 2%. I'm just wondering, what you see is, you didn't sound like you wanted to target level of debt, but what you see is the downsides of being that sort of specific. What would be the arguments against it?
Well, I think it would be wrong to assume that we know, and I think what we've seen is in an environment, it is a function of what the affordability of that debt is, and given that has changed quite significantly in a downward direction over the last several years, and one doesn't know what it might change in the future. I think it's probably right to think more about trajectories of debt levels, building resilience for future shocks, and the affordability of that debt. I think is probably a better approach than trying to be precise about that. And you're right that those were the old. I think they were the old rules. They were the Maastricht rules as well. I think from
yeah. The Maastricht rules, which have both on national debt and on borrowing and the deficit.
Yeah.
The 3%, if I remember rightly. In the budget, the biggest stimulus you have is obviously the super deduction over the next couple of years, which is directed particularly at businesses. You haven't done stimulus for consumers in the same way as before. I mean, you've obviously continued things like the VAT cuts and so on, but you don't have schemes like the Eat Out to help out. Was there a particular reason for thinking about stimulating business rather than stimulating consumption, or balancing it?
I mean, I think it goes to the conversation we're having with Felicity. I think we're probably now more have higher confidence that there will be consumption-led recovery even without intervention than we did before, because we've seen it now happen, and consumer confidence is at different levels, and there is a considerable amount of excess savings. So I think you can have more confidence that you don't need to intervene to do that, and there's actually probably a lot of pent-up desire. I think that investment is different, and investment has really suffered. It's down 20%. Over the course of the year, or year over year, I think, and that unlocking that is probably something where policy can make a difference. So we thought that was right for us to focus, and that was based on conversations with many economists as well as we were formulating policy. That was a general view that when we had talking to lots of people about what they thought right policy for this point in the cycle was, that there was actually quite a lot of consensus on that point from people. And I would just say, in the short term, things like furlough, self-employment scheme, and these things, in one sense, are consumption stimuluses. What are they doing? They're supporting people's incomes. Ultimately, that some of that will find its way into the economy. So that is actually, I think the OBR might even have talked about the demand benefit, the benefit on aggregate demand from things like CGRS and SAYS, which are, CGRS is a labour markets intervention, but also has the benefit of providing consumption support.
Yeah, I would just add on that. I mean, obviously, also the ABR's forecast was for a strong recovery in consumption, absent additional policy, whereas their forecast for investment is significantly boosted by the super deduction. So if you would take the super deduction away, you would have a very strong consumption recovery, but not a very strong investment recovery. So it's also about responding to what's in the forecast.
I think all your measures to boost growth are obviously welcome. I know there'll be questions about that later. I have a sort of a high-level question about growth. When we had our economists here, and we asked them about how to get down the national debt, clearly there's tax rises, there's spending cuts, but growth is obviously a key way to reduce debt as a proportion of GDP. And you look back at the post-war period, and we had very strong growth in the 1950s, and really it was that eroded the national debt down to below 100% of GDP ultimately. Do you agree with the economists that actually we just can't rely on growth as much now as we could back after the Second World War? And so it's actually going to be traditional fiscal measures of tax rises and spending cuts that are going to have to do the heavy lifting in terms of balancing the books?
Yeah, I'd make a couple of observations actually. That period also was characterised by very high inflation, as well as high real growth. And obviously, for debt dynamics, you can erode debt to GDP ratios with high inflation. I think you had evidence from people on this. I don't think that's.
Everyone thought that was a bad idea to go for that.
Yeah, so I don't think that we should, that there should be a kind of active policy desire to do that. And the flip side of the interest rates are low because structurally around the world, global real growth in developed economies is lower than it was. But I think the other thing is what the forecast already assumed for growth would rank it as, I think, from memory, about, give or take, about the 8th highest in a 5-year growth period in 120 years of record. So what's already in the forecast is very punchy growth, right? And we still have the challenges we have with public finances, which is why we had to make some of the decisions we did. More growth is obviously good and helpful, and hopefully the interventions that we have put in place, can surprise us on the upside when it comes to future growth.
And finally, last question, because I'm running out of time. As you said, at the end of the period, you've got the national debt stabilising and coming down slightly. Do you think you'll have room for fiscal relaxation towards the end of this period and future budgets?
I think it's a bit early to be speculating. Yeah, a bit early to be speculating, Anthony.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm going to go to Angela now, please.
Very much, Chair. Afternoon, Chancellor.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Could you tell us why you've budgeted to spend less on public services post 2022 than you'd planned pre-pandemic?
There's no plan assumption. That all that is, Angela, is a planning assumption, and all the change in this budget document has relative to the others is maintaining mechanically the same real terms growth rate of 2.1%, and that flexes with the GDP deflators as they change, and that's all that assumption is mechanically. It's the same assumption we've had for, I think, at least certainly the last fiscal event, and maybe the one before that. But it just moves. And the flip side to that is if the inflation estimates and the deflator estimates were higher and we didn't adjust the thing the other way, everyone would say, that's a real terms cut in spending assumption. So all we do is very mechanically adjust the medium term spending assumption by the GDP deflator change. And that's all that is. It's very mechanical.
Okay. 16 billion is a mechanical change. However, I understand the explanation that you've given. So can we just turn to the negotiations for the NHS settlement for next financial year, which after all starts in 21 days? They haven't been concluded yet, have they?
No, that's obviously got nothing to do with the budget, but no, that pay review body process progresses to a different timeline as it does every year and concludes in the summer.
The settlement for the NHS is what I'm talking about. Obviously, that does involve pay.
Sorry, the overall settlement for the NHS for the 5 years is already done. That was as part of the 5-year plan, where there's an extra £34 billion a year going into the NHS day to day. That the NHS benefits from a long-term funding settlement.
No, I understand that, but you've budgeted last year, understandably, for an increase because of the COVID costs in NHS budgeting. And my understanding is that you haven't yet let the NHS know what extra it will be getting this coming financial year because of COVID costs.
So you're talking about COVID costs specifically. There's always a kind of ongoing perennial dialogue with all departments, including DH, about COVID costs for next year. We've set aside £55 billion from memory at the spending review, bulk of which was allocated, a bulk of which was unallocated. And as things come up, the whole point was that we would work with departments because it was very uncertain. Yep. No one quite knew. So those conversations are going on all the time, not just with DH, but with all departments. I wouldn't obviously talk about those in public, but that happens all the time.
But 21 days to go, they still don't really know what they're going to get, is my understanding.
We talk to the departments all the time. They do have budgets for next year, but given the evolving situation, we are constantly, as we were over the last year, adjusting to circumstances on the ground based on what's going on, and that's why we put aside a very significant amount of extra funding for coronavirus this next year, £55 billion, not all of which was allocated at the SR to do exactly that. And the whole intention was it would be allocated over the course of the year, not all in advance of the year, depending on how things evolved.
Well, let's hope they know before the new financial year actually begins. Can you tell me why you think that nurses are only worth a 1% increase, which in real terms is actually a pay cut?
Again, that's part of a separate process, not to do with the budget, but there's a pay review body process which the government participates in. What the Department of Health do is make a recommendation to that body based on affordability, and then the body will take that evidence into account as it looks at everything in the round and come back with a recommendation later on. As I said, towards that process concludes towards the summer. I guess the broader public sector.
When I was a minister in large spending departments, obviously also a minister in the Treasury, I don't think a day went by when the Treasury weren't involved in discussions with the spending departments about issues like this. Are you saying you've had nothing to do with it at all and the 1% offer was a surprise?
No, obviously it's one government, Angela, so in one sense it's all one government, it's government policy. But what I would say is I set out a broader approach to public sector pay back in November at the spending review, which took account of the circumstances we were facing economically, and as for a matter of fairness and also to protect people's jobs in the public sector given what was going on in the private sector, we set out a targeted approach to public sector pay, which we thought was proportionate, fair and reasonable. What that did is ensure that those in the NHS would actually receive a pay rise next year. In other parts of the public sector, that will not be the case next year. But we did also protect those on the lowest income. So if you earn less than the median salary of about £25,000, just under, you receive an increase of at least £250 next year. So that's a targeted approach to public sector pay that was set out in November. It will mean that the majority of those working in the public sector will see a pay rise next year, but that's being done in a more targeted way in recognition of the circumstances that we face. But then the way that happens is departments have a process individually with their pay review bodies where they present evidence, and that happens bilaterally.
Okay, I mean, I have to say, I think the response from NHS staff to the pay offer they've got demonstrates what they think about it, even though you think it's fair and reasonable. Can I go on and talk about value for money in expenditure, Chancellor? Because we've briefly touched on this when we've talked before, but procurement and value for money. Yesterday, the National Audit Office produced an excoriating report about NHS test and trace, £37 billion of public expenditure, and they said that they could find that it had no clear impact. Nick McPherson, who was a permanent secretary at the Treasury when I was there, said that this test and trace wins the prize for the most wasteful and inept public expenditure programme of all time. The extraordinary thing is that no one in the government seems surprised or shocked. Were you surprised or shocked?
Well, I haven't seen the full report, Angela, but what I would say with regard to test and trace is, I think considering where we were at the beginning of this, when I think I remember it right, we could do 10,000 tests a day, and we obviously knew testing could be an enormous part of the toolkit in trying to suppress the spread of the virus. An enormous amount of investment rightly was put in to trying to increase the amount of testing and then contact tracing. And we're now able, I think in the last few days, 750,000 tests or more. So that's a fantastic achievement. And I think the people that have helped that happen deserve a lot of credit for that, because it is an important part of our armoury as we combat this disease. And now our testing capacity ranks, I think, is one of the best internationally, but obviously the Department for Health and NHS Test and Trace run the operations of that.
So you have no worries about value for money with respect to that 37 billion of public expenditure. Let's go on and talk about PPE procurement. When you were last before us, you said that the Chief Secretary would write to us in the new year regarding the spending control framework used throughout for procurement of PPE. We've seen again excoriating National Audit Office reports on waste that happened there, and we've just learned that £900 million of COVID-related contracts have been awarded to firms which have donated the Conservative Party, all without proper competition, much without transparency. Again, are you worried about this in any way?
So, Angela, I can't obviously comment on the details of specific contracts because we're not the awarding department for PPE contracts. I know the Health Secretary is committed to publishing transparently the details of contracts, and I know all contracts go through, I think it's 8 specific tests, and that's the approach that has been taken in all these cases. So that's as much as I can probably say on that. We obviously exercise the usual managing public money control framework through the Treasury, which Dan can speak to, but I don't know if we have time. But obviously, given we were dealing with a pandemic, it was appropriate that we approached this with a degree of flexibility. Remember, everyone, remember the PPE conversations we were all having at the beginning of this, and again, what the track record is now, the vast majority of the PPE is actually manufactured domestically, I think, except for gloves, and billions of pieces of kit have been supplied across the country. That's good and important, and I think again the teams that have done that did extraordinarily well. But Dan, I don't know if you want to comment on the framework side of it.
I mean, just in terms of the procurement rules, the pre-existing procurement rules allow for speedy contracts, speedy processes for procuring things where there is an emergency. And those were obviously used during the early phases of the pandemic last year in order to provide the PPE that was required on the front line. As the Chancellor said, every single procurement has an 8-point check about. Sorry, I'm going to try and remember the eight points there. It has to go through. But
you don't have to tell us the 8 points. I'm just concerned when a lot of public money is being spent, you've got excoriating reports from National Audit Office, and nothing seems to be being done to get a grip of it. You can talk about 8 points all you like, but there's an awful lot of waste of public money and resources that has gone into these 2 areas. You seem to be giving a technocratic answer. Parliament gave the government the chance to do this contracting without using the usual rules, and I would have thought it was the Treasury's role to make sure that it was done properly.
Angela, you make a very good point, right? Making sure that taxpayers' money is spent well is really important. It's important to me, it's important to the Treasury, it should be important to all of us. You're absolutely right to highlight that. Of course I take that seriously. And if there are lessons to learn for all of us as a result of this when we go through all the reports, of course we will learn them. But I think we have to just also, all I'd say is, whilst saying that, it's important to remember the context that we're operating at at the time. And vaccines is another area where we took a more flexible approach to how contracting is normally done to speed things up, to provide that flexibility to the vaccine task force, and that is, hopefully one of the small reasons that contributed to our ability to move quickly, build a vaccine portfolio. So that flexibility in the face of the pandemic, I think, is important. But you're right, we should be judicious about using it. It's not our money we're spending at the end of the day, and if there are lessons we can learn off, we go through these reports, and of course we will. That's very, very reasonable to ask.
One final question, Chancellor. In the interest of transparency, can you tell us whether you've benefited from the huge increase in the Moderna share price as a potential owner of Moderna shares?
I think, Angela, all my register of interests have disclosed to the Cabinet Office in the normal way and are available transparently for anyone to see there.
But they're not really transparent, are they? You could choose transparency to tell us whether you personally
all my disclosures, Angela, are in accordance with the Cabinet Office guidelines and have been gone over rigorously and are published in the normal way.
So you're not prepared to just add that extra bit of information for us today, whether you have benefited personally from the huge...
I would, on all things, directly to my register of members' interests and all of the things that I provide to the Cabinet Office they have. And I think they've issued statements about this as well.
I think that's as about opaque as it comes. Thank you, Chancellor.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. Going to Alison, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, when you announced the Winter Economy Plan back in September, you said that as the economy reopens, it's fundamentally wrong to hold people in jobs that only exist inside the furlough. Do you still believe that?
Yeah, longer term, it's appropriate that we help people find find opportunities if the current job that they're in is not one that is likely to survive. And we talked before about scarring and the fact that there already are 1 million people, or close to 750,000 people, who have lost their jobs, with more forecasts to come. And I've always said we're not going to be able to save every single job through this crisis. That is a tragedy. So it's actually not in anyone's interest longer term to be out of the labour market for long periods of time. And that's the balance you've got to get right. You want to provide the support in the way that we have, but also provide opportunities for people to get new skills. And that's why we have a plan for jobs that provides employers with a very generous bonus for apprenticeships. We have new traineeships, we have the Kickstart scheme, we have a lifetime skills guarantee. All of those things are in place to help those people who sadly their current job may not be there, and help them find something new to do.
Thank you. And with regard to the Taxpayer Protection Task Force that you have announced in your budget of £100 million and 1,265 HMRC staff to combat fraud, why is it taking you so long to establish this?
Well, I think we have regular fraud going on, checks going on all the time, Alison, and there's teams of people who have been working on this. What we wanted to do now at this moment is to significantly beef up the resources. Now we have a better sense of where we are with everything, and what this investment will do, the £100 million, the extra over 1,000 full-time FTEs, is use the information that we've learned. So we figured out how we can do targeting in a much more effective way using the data we have, and we're now at a different stage of the pandemic, which allows us to do that and create the resource to do it. And I think that that's the right thing to do, whether it's on some of the HMRC interventions like CJRS and others, but also on things like bounce back loans, where we're working with BEIS, the Insolvency Service, Companies House, to put in place some regulatory changes that will enable us to tackle fraud there. I don't know, Dan, anything?
The only other thing that I would add is obviously one of the first steps in preventing fraud is the design of the schemes, and that was very much, even though they were designed at pace, the way we designed the schemes in order to try and find data that we had to check whether a claim was legitimate, to remove opportunities for people to manipulate their affairs before a scheme came into effect, so they could sort of generate, they could make it appear that they qualified for something and so on. So that is the kind of the first step. Obviously, as the Chancellor says, we now have much more data. I mean, HMRC are real experts at using their data to target interventions, because they collect a lot of data from different sources which tell them about businesses' activities in particular. And this is about actually giving them even further resource, given the stage that we're at, and also given that we're extending the schemes to minimise the opportunity for fraud, and in order to crack down where it is occurring and recover the money for the public.
How much money do you expect to get back?
The forecasts are in the, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the forecasts are in the Red Book, Alison. So there's a line which explains the investment in and then the returns back over the back end of the scorecard. It's worth also bearing in mind that we think some of the return will come beyond the forecast period from memory. But Dan, if you've got the numbers.
Yeah, I'm just trying to. It's well, so it rises to over £1 billion a year by the end of the forecast. So it's over 2 billion over the 3 years between 2023, 24 and 2025, 26.
That's the mix of all the interventions, right?
That's
the mix of all the various
HMRC's. That's the consequence of HMRC's investment in wider investment.
It's not just coronavirus. Yeah, there's general compliance. So there's a bunch of different initiatives under that. The details which are all there that build up to that number, which is typical at any budget. We will work with HMRC to see what.
It's a bit of a shame, frankly, that you're now putting money into HMRC when people have been saying for a very long time that if you invest in HMRC staff, you'll get money back. But we'll leave that as it is. I've had many constituents who have been victims to some extent of furlough fraud, where their employer has made submissions, but that money has not gone to my constituents, and they've had nothing at all and haven't been able to claim universal credit either, because they are supposed to be employed, but they've not had that money. Will they get any of their money back?
Well, Alison, I'd be grateful if you could write to me with the specific names of the firms and the details, and we can pass them on to the fraud unit MHMRC. And delighted to look at that. That's obviously that's awful to hear. And that's great that we've got specific examples of it. Please do send them. And then we will get them onto the right team at HMRC pronto.
Because it seems in the way in which the fraud investigations are going about that the companies will be pursued, but the constituents at the end of the day who haven't had their wages will still have no money at the end of it.
Well, I mean, if you get the details over to us, then we can see what exactly, or over to HMRC, then they can see what exactly has happened. So.
Okay, thank you. I will certainly be in touch on that. The Directors' Income Support Scheme has been proposed by the FSB and others. Where are you at in looking at those schemes, and will you accept that those who have not had any support from the government through the coronavirus do need to have some kind of money coming in?
So the Financial Secretary to the Treasury has met with the particular groups. So we looked at that scheme in detail, and unfortunately, it's not one that can be implemented, without actually following on from your previous questions about fraud, not leaving the taxpayer exposed to an enormous amount of fraud risk. And the basic problem, as you know, is that there is no objective, verifiable way to identify the groups of people that I think you're referring to. But we were able to make, I guess I'd just gently say two things. One is we were able to make quite a significant change in eligibility for the SAFE scheme by those who now have filed a new tax return for 1920 able to be brought into the system, which is great news. And that will bring just over 600,000 more people into the system, many of them for the first time, which is great. So that is one of the big things that people wanted that we're able to do. And then even though this one thing might not be working for people in a particular way, there are so many other things that we have also done during this crisis, which do provide support to people in different ways. And I think it is perfectly possible that one of those other things may be something that helps people, whether it's help through discretionary funding with their council tax bill, for example. 3.5 million people benefited from that, or indeed things like the mortgage holidays, which we negotiated with the banks to provide quite easy 6-month mortgage holidays for people as well. So there's lots of things in there, and I appreciate some people will feel that they haven't quite got the help they want in the way they want it, but there are the other things out there which hopefully will help too.
Well, I can give you a pretty concrete example of a constituent of mine who runs a beauty business. She has been able to furlough her staff, but has had to pay national insurance contributions for her staff from her own savings. But as a limited company director, she's not entitled to anything herself. That's not fair, is it, Chancellor?
Well, if she's running a beauty company, it's a different situation, I won't know, but it's perfectly possible that she has premises, she'll have a business rates holiday, she would be receiving cash grants throughout this crisis. We included personal care very specifically in the more generous up to £18,000 grants for personal care, even though they're opening earlier, but they'll be with some restrictions which impact the business. So that's there for them. So I think there are other things that help. The bounce back loans may well have helped her, and she can, of course, furlough herself for her PAYE income, which she may well have during her thing. And as I said, there'll be other things more personally that she may have been able to receive help with.
She can't, and I think that situation is still particularly unfair, given that she's done what she can for her employees. For the first CEAS grant, the HMRC's planning assumption was that fraud and error could range between 1% and 2%. What's your estimation for the Directors' Income Support Scheme? I
haven't got it to hand, but it will have been higher than 1% to 2% from memory. But I can go over it and get it back to you. And I don't know if you have. I don't.
I don't. I mean, the thing that I recall is that of the people receiving dividend income, we estimated that only around a quarter of them would be classified as directors, and given that would be the main. So there's the potential that 3/4 of the recipients of help through something targeting dividends would not actually be directors, and therefore it's not fraud, but it just shows the difficulty of actually.
That's a different thing.
Yeah, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the potential issue. I think Dan's absolutely right. But the problem is no one actually knows how many company owner managers there are in the UK, because there's no objective, verifiable definition of what that means. So no one actually has a number. Even people who are talking about it would say that we don't know. We roughly think there are 600,000, I think, from memory, give or take, right? Is a number that's out there. No one actually knows. The problem is, as Dan said, we received 3.3 million tax returns about dividends. So that just gives you a sense of how large the difference is, and there's no verifiable way to go from the 3.3 to the 600,000. So as Dan says, we've been talking rightly about taxpayer money and balancing, risk for the taxpayer and value for money. 3 in every £4 going out potentially is going to people who are not designed for it to benefit. And that's the challenge, and that's always the challenge we've had with this.
There are many inconsistencies in the scheme of people getting money who didn't necessarily need all of the support, and some people getting absolutely nothing at all. That doesn't seem to be a reason not to do it. Moving on to another barrier, a lack of data has been a barrier to the newly self-employed accessing CESE, and we're all very glad in the committee that the newly self-employed are now eligible for grants going forward. But why is it that those who have now submitted their 1920 self-assessment can't get that retrospectively, because that data still applies, does it not?
Well, I don't think, Alison, it would be right, because if you're going to retrospectively do it for them, why not others as well? And I think actually, if you retrospectively opened up 3 point or however many million people's tax returns and SAYS grants and recalculated them all, that would be the sensible, appropriate thing to do. It would mean lots of people would have less money that they were given. You'd have to get all of that back. So I don't think that would be appropriate. I think the key ask from stakeholders was that it would work on a prospective basis. I think that was reasonable, and I'm delighted we've been able to do that, and it will benefit, as I said, over 600,000 people.
Okay, thank you. And finally, 70,000 women who had their babies during the 3 years over which CESE was calculated have clearly lost out. Why haven't you fixed this mistake?
I think actually we do have guidance. We do have guidance that is out there around dealing with maternity leave and other things. But I know there's obviously subject to a court case as well, so there's not much more I can say on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And going to Harriet, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chancellor, for all of the hard work that you and your team are doing to give this unprecedented support to the UK economy. And I know that you published a household distribution and analysis which shows that the support has very much been going to those on the lowest incomes. It's been very progressive. And given that this week we've got International Women's Day, I wanted to sort of take a gender lens as well. And clearly women have benefited more than men from the furlough scheme. Women have benefited more than men from the uplift in universal credit. They've seen a smaller hit overall to employment. And I just wondered whether the Treasury considered producing an equalities impact assessment this time with a focus on gender, age and ethnic minority status.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. And you are, you're absolutely right about the distribution analysis, which is in there. It's something that I'm proud of, and I think we said at the outset we wanted to make sure that those who are the most vulnerable did get the support they needed, and I'm glad that the distribution analysis in the budget document bears that out. And you're absolutely right to highlight the disproportionate impact that this crisis was having on women, given that they're likely to be in the industries that are most affected, and they have disproportionately borne the burden of the impact on schools and other things. So I'm pleased that when I last checked, I think the gender employment rate gap is at a record low, and that's including the last data that was for, Dan, correct me, I think is October to December last year, which is so it's quite recent. And we know that actually you've seen larger falls in employment, I think you were hinting at this, among men rather than women. So in that sense, even though they're disproportionately working in these sectors, we've been able to help protect, and the gender pay gap is, I think, at the lowest level it's been. And that's why I think our interventions on hospitality in particular are important for women, because they disproportionately work in that sector, and hopefully whether it's the VAT cut, things we did last summer or else, will all make a difference. But I don't know, Dan, in terms of what we publish and why, because I know we went around. On
the impact analysis, I think that there's a significant analytical challenge here in that people live in households, and but a lot of these measures are about individuals, and so in order to construct something, particularly to construct this sort of analysis, for example, on along the lines of gender, you would have to make assumptions about how households share that income or the effect of the schemes, and ultimately that assumption would drive the outputs. And so it's a question of producing something meaningful. I mean, clearly when we're advising the Chancellor on policies, we take very seriously our obligations under the Equalities Act, which is to advise them on a particular equality impacts. But when it comes to producing the type of analysis which we produce by income decile, that issue of the assumption about how a household splits its income is totally determines the outcome, and therefore we just don't think it's that meaningful. And this is something that I think the IFS have said, this issue of the assumption makes it very difficult to produce accurate analysis.
So this is under all circumstances, then the Treasury will never be able to publish an equality impact assessment of the measures effectively.
In terms of the types of analysis that we produce on household income and the income deciles, the distributional analysis,
it's hard at that. Yeah.
I think it would just be so driven by the assumption that you make about the sharing of income within a household that it would render it not very meaningful, because how you show that assumption would drive the outputs. So I think it's not a question of it's not technically possible. It's just it wouldn't meaningfully add to people's understanding of the impacts in the way that the income decile analysis, which is now well established, and we produced it on a different basis recently. So looking at as we did with the ad hoc release last year about the impact of the pandemic and the government's response to it, particularly the furlough scheme by income decile, that sort of new analysis we've not done before, but again it's this household versus individuals within a household, which really is very tricky.
No, I'm not, obviously the protected characteristics, but I completely agree with the point about the difference in terms of employment. There was a very good report out from the House of Commons Library this week in terms of the difference between men and women in employment over the last year. But there is one category where women are 1.5 times more likely to have lost work or quit over the last year, and that's for mothers versus fathers. And Chancellor, you yourself said last week, we owe mums an enormous debt of thanks. And I just wanted to pick up on my colleague Alison Thulis's question about this issue around maternity leave, because we very much welcome the inclusion of the additional 600,000 people into the self-employed income support scheme. I know that it is a live court case, and that does limit what you can say, Chancellor, but I just wondered if you could share with the committee whether or not you considered, in the run-up to preparing and publishing this budget, you considered how you might rectify that issue.
So Harriet, I'm not being difficult. It's just because there is an ongoing court case, it's difficult for me to say anything. But what I can do is, when we design the policies, we have these things in mind, and that's why the guidance which we published at the time, acknowledged it and provided flexibility in a different way to think through it, to try and provide what we could, the best we could, try and address some of the challenges that it poses. So beyond that, I can't say anything else. But we did think about it even as we were designing the policy, as you would expect us to, rightly. And you are right about mums. And one thing that I am pleased that we're able to do, and it was important for this reason, was to keep childcare settings in early years open. We all have lots of difficult judgments to make about what to do to suppress the spread of the virus, but as we allocate our budget, as the Prime Minister talks about it, keeping childcare settings open in early years is something that I think hopefully has made a difference and helped parents.
And just more generally, sorry, I was just going to add on there have been a number of things over the course of the last year where, for example, explicit guidance has been given to employers about their ability to furlough employees who can't work because of childcare responsibilities. We've made changes to ensure that people who were on parental leave and then returned after the furlough cut-off date were eligible for furlough. Likewise, people who went on to maternity leave after a period on furlough, that their maternity entitlements were calculated correctly, and so on.
Yeah.
So where we've identified issues, we've tried to build it into the policy.
Thanks. Can I just quickly turn to the domestic abuse, where you added another 19 million to the budget, including 15 million for perpetrator programmes. And I've certainly seen in Worcestershire how effective perpetrator programmes can be. Is there any evidence that you can share with us in terms of those being more effective than other approaches, or do you have any particular value for money points you want to make on those?
Yeah, I guess one of the hidden, maybe hopefully not that hidden tragedies of lockdown has been the increase in domestic abuse and calls to the hotline. I forget the stat, but they were up very considerably. The spending review provided a large chunk, £125 million additional for local authorities for next year, so they can meet all their new duties under the domestic abuse bill. So what we announced in budget was £19 million, and that was split. £15 million was for perpetrator programs, and then £5 million was for a piloting of respite rooms, and it's based on a trial, a successful. So both of those are, these are smaller amounts of money to trial new things and gather more evidence and hopefully make a difference, which can inform future policy making. The perpetrator program, I think, is modelled on something called Drive, from memory, and I think there's obviously would be a Home Office thing. I think that the Drive program showed that it could reduce domestic abuse by 80% from memory, and controlled behaviour was reduced by 70%. So that's what that's based on. I can get you more details from the Home Office, and then the respite rooms are based on a programme that is already being trialled in London. I think they're called green rooms from memory. I'll have to get you the name. But so we're basically trying to scale those things up to try them in a larger fashion. But they're based on evidence that certainly the perpetrator programmes work and benefit women.
Thanks. And now turning to the very poorest people in the world, the announced change in terms of the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5. Obviously, it is still the law of the land that you try and spend 0.7. I appreciate that you can make a statement to Parliament to say that you haven't achieved that. But what is your plan legally to do this within 2021, 2022?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. I know it's an issue that you care passionately about, and I appreciate that. So the Foreign Secretary, obviously responsible for the department and for legislation in this regard, said, as I think one of my colleagues reiterated at Treasury questions the other day, and I would just refer you back to that, but what he said afterwards in the statement that he made was that he would set out legislative plans in due course, and I know that that's something he plans to do.
So in due course means before the beginning of the next financial year, or are you planning to go into the next financial year knowing that you're going to break the law effectively?
No, I think I obviously would not want to be ever breaking the law, Harriet. So I because he's responsible for the legislation, I couldn't give you anything more specific than what I've told you. But as he said right afterwards, and I think we reiterated the other day, that he will bring forward the appropriate legislation. But obviously, in all cases, we would want to be compliant with the law.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thanks, Harriet. Going to Julie, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, Chancellor. Good afternoon, Dan.
Hi, Julie.
Hi. I've got some questions on corporation tax, but before I turn to that, could I just ask you about the COVID grants, the emergency grants, which we've had reports that some businesses who are struggling have had difficulty accessing those from the council. Have you got an assessment of what problems they've been having and what the Treasury has been doing to make it easier and to get through that?
Yeah, Julie, you're right. And I guess it mainly concerns the discretionary funding that councils have, which is obviously up to them. We had two grant schemes running over the past several months. One were the ones that were become more automatic types of businesses that were closed by restrictions, and they were monthly. And then separately, and we announced a top up to that in January, local councils have discretionary funding. Now, it's definitely the case that that money has not all gone out in aggregate. I can't remember, but it's less than 30%. It's far too small a number. So so the department responsible, I think it's BEIS rather than MHCLG, slightly oddly, but the ministers have spent a lot of time working with local authorities to try and see what we can do to speed that up. We are publishing the guidance imminently for the new restart grant. So that guidance is going to be published imminently. It might not be this week, but it hopefully is very shortly, in advance of those grants going out. And the money for that will go to local councils the week commencing the 5th of April, I think it is, for the up to £18,000 restart grants. And what we've said to councils is you won't get the top up the new amount, the 400 million plus of discretionary funding, until you've already spent the stuff you've already got, to encourage them to speed, get that out the door, get it to businesses. You're absolutely right. We kind of send it away from here to councils, but they're the ones that have to do it. And look, in their defence, I think if you had them here, what they would say is, you know what, this government's been, they've come too many grant schemes. They're all a bit different. And then that slowed things down, and fair enough, that might well have been the case, right? Because we've iterated these things a couple of times. So to the extent that is partly our fault, that's so be it. That's why, in particular, when we did the new ones, we wanted to do them as a one-off grant, restart grant. It was much easier for councils to do that and get it out the door quickly. So that hopefully will help as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. So turning to corporation tax, Chancellor, as we know, you have increased the corporation tax from the 1st of April 2023 to 25%. Did you assess the dangers to businesses and the economy of increasing it all in one go rather than taking a phased approach?
Yes. So, Julie, we went through all of that. What we wanted to do was a couple of things. One is make sure that we still had an internationally competitive rate, and this was still a pro-business place, and I'm confident that that is the case. And also we wanted to make sure that the timing of the rate increase was one that would be supportive of our recovery in the short term. And I think we've achieved both of those things. I think the third thing I'd add is certainty. And businesses wanted, and they told us very clearly, what they wanted was certainty. They didn't want something hanging over them, not knowing what. That certainty is helpful to businesses, so we wanted to deliver that, and I think that's been welcomed. Corporation tax is ultimately a tax on profits, so it's only by definition those businesses that are doing well that pay it, and we think it was easier to do it in one go. We do have the very generous super deduction between now and then, and businesses have the certainty of knowing that they can plan now, and we still have a rate that I believe will keep us as a competitive economy.
If you think of corporation tax as our shop window to the world, though, do you think it's going to be a disincentive to direct investment from abroad?
So what I'd say is, and I thought there's an interesting report from PwC out today where they survey all their managers, and I think the chap who ran that made a comment about this. Like, if you think about that shop window of our attractiveness to business, I mean, you're absolutely right to think about it like that. I think about it like that as well. What I'd say is corporation tax is not the whole shop window. Corporation tax is just one of the things in the shop window, and there are lots of other things in the shop window as well that are going to entice people to come through the door. And I think even with the higher rate, it's still on the OECD way that they look at them, the lowest rate in the G7, the fifth lowest rate in the G20, with only Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Russia and Turkey below us. Obviously lowest in the G7, the US is forecast to go up much higher, is the stated plan of the administration there. And as what's clear is, if you, for example, the chap from PwC today was saying, or the chief economist from Ernst & Young said a little while ago, actually corporation tax rates are probably not the significant driver as long as they're in this kind of range. The things that companies are looking at are things like skills levels, infrastructure, and even in the tax system, this is what the PwC chap said, it's not just the headline rate, it's the overall package of the tax system. How easy is it to use? What are the other reliefs that are in place, for example, supporting things like R&D? So that's what I'd say. I think if you look at the shop window as a whole, there's lots of things in there, lots of goodies that will just make sure that this is a really attractive place to come and do business. And I'm confident that will be the case, even at the slightly higher rate.
Thank you. So obviously we can need growth. That's kind of a given. But so you've made an assessment that the harm to growth from increasing corporation tax in the way you have is less than doing another way, using VAT, for example, income tax.
Well, I mean, obviously the forecasts are what they are. So you'll see the forecasts, and they obviously the OBR they make all their assumptions about the impact that the things that we do have on the economy. So that's taken into account. With VAT and I think you said income tax. Obviously, we had a manifesto commitment not to raise the rates of VAT or income tax and national insurance, and I wanted to honour those commitments, and so that's why obviously we have looked elsewhere.
Thank you. And just turning to the super deduction, what assessment have you made of the types of businesses that will benefit from the super deduction?
Well, hopefully lots of them, but it will be those that invest in capital equipment predominantly. It's capital investment where we have had the but the multi-decade challenge, where if you look since the early 90s, we ranked lower than our European competitors, Australia, Canada, America, when it comes to capital investment as a percentage of GDP. And we know that capital investment is good because it drives up productivity and it creates jobs, it spurs innovation. So, and it can hopefully play a really important part in our recovery over the next year or two. So businesses that make capital investments, those are typically long-term decisions, big amounts of money. I think they're the ones that will hopefully sit up, see this, it's very generous, grab their attention and, incentivize them to do things that they either were not going to do for a while or that they weren't going to do at all. And I think we will all benefit as a result.
And as we take the case that it's a powerful investment, it's limited to plant and machinery. So was there a case, for example, to extend it to more intangibles, IP, for example, and other areas?
Right. Well, I'll make one observation. I know Dan will probably add another comment on intangibles. I'd say, look, the other things we have in the tax system are the R&D tax credits, for example, which are, again, the OECD have a ranking of those, and we rank relatively favourably for the generosity of those. They're split into two types. There's something called RDEC and something called the SME tax credit. What we announced the budget actually is quite a wholesale kind of consultation to look at what do we need to do to make sure that tax credit, or that tax incentive for R&D is internationally competitive and takes into account of how R&D is being conducted today. So, for example, things like cloud computing are not considered R&D under the definitions. There's an argument for maybe changing that. So there are some things we're looking at there. Last budget last year, I improved the generosity of that of the RDEC limit as well. So we just did that at last budget, made that more generous. But Dan, do you want to add on the intangibles? Anything else?
Yeah, I suppose the other thing that I would add on intangibles is where you create an intangible, it tends to be a revenue cost. So you're already able to write off the full cost of the staff that are working on the brand of your company or generating the goodwill that your company has, or the intellectual property where it's non-R&D. R&D, as the Chancellor said, we already give more than 100% relief for smaller businesses and have the RDEC for bigger businesses. So if you're a larger business that is creating intangible assets, you're probably able to deduct 100% of the cost already. Whereas for capital allowances, without the super deduction for shorter life assets, for typical assets that you would write off over a sort of 10, 15-year period, you would get 16% of the cost in the year that you made the investment, and then a 16% writing down allowance. And for longer life investments, so things which last for a long period or are part of the fabric of the building, like cabling or lifts, those things you would get 6%. Whereas under the super deduction, we're changing the balance in the short term, where you'll get 130% for the sort of normal life assets, and then 50% for the long life assets. So in a sense, because of the nature of the expenditure which generates the intangible assets, the tax system is naturally generous to it anyway.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm told I'm out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. And going to Siobhan, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask the Chancellor, would you agree with me that we have a housing crisis in the UK?
Well, I think what we do have is a challenge for particularly young people to buy their own home. It's been a challenge that we've seen for a long time, and which is why we're doing a lot to try and improve that situation, whether it's planning reforms, investment into housing, stamp duty holiday temporarily, or the new mortgage guarantee.
Yeah. Chancellor, there are 1.15 million families on social housing waiting lists. There are 120,240 children living in temporary accommodation, and 9% of the social rented sector is classed as overcrowded, with the Health Foundation concluding that overcrowded housing may have contributed to increased deaths during the pandemic. How does your budget help any of these families?
So I'd say probably the budget is primarily designed to deal with tax policy and economic policy, or not all other aspects of public spending and social policy. Now we deal with some of that at spending review, and so at spending review in November, I think it was then we announced the Affordable Homes Programme for the next few years, which from memory is just over £12 billion. I want to say over 200,000 new homes, but that I haven't got the number in my head, and that's an uplift a significant uplift on where the programme that it is replacing. So that's probably the social housing intervention, but that's part of spending review. Obviously, budgets were primarily for tax and economic policy.
Although, Charles, could I just add that obviously in the last budget there was the increase in the local housing allowance to the 30th percentile, which has been maintained in cash terms for this budget, which is worth about £600 for 1.5 million households, and for the 500,000 households in the areas of the highest demand, it's worth £1,200 on average.
Mrs. B in my constituency lives with her 4 children, 11, 7, 3 and 2, in a 1-bedroom Clarion Housing Association flat. She is in Band C on the housing register, but there are 129 families with more points than her. Given the council had just 17 3-bedroom properties in the last 10 months, it will take an extraordinary 7 years until she is housed. By then, her children will be 18, 14, 10 and 9. What hopes was there in the budget for Mrs. B and her family?
Sorry, Siobhan, maybe if you'd like me with the specific details, it sounds like it's more constituency casework. I'll happily pick it up with the housing department or her council if that's the appropriate thing. But obviously the details of that particular situation is one that we can deal with like that. I think it's probably best on that one.
My use of this lady's situation is to illustrate the intensity and difficulties of the problem that do not appear to be considered in your budget or world view. And these are real people with real children living in desperate situations made worse by the pandemic and lockdown. Can you imagine living in a 1-bedroom flat with 4 children and for it to be without end?
So, sure, that's what I said, why we've actually increased the investment that's going into social housing through the Affordable Homes Programme, which at over £12 billion will be significantly larger than it has been in the past, and will provide hundreds of thousands of better quality homes for people. But that was done in the spending review. I don't have the particular details for your constituents' case. Obviously, budgets can't deal with every aspect of every policy that government does. They're predominantly for tax, fiscal and economic policy, and that is why it's just that the spending review would ordinarily deal with social housing investment. And I'm, as I said, pleased to say that the Affordable Homes Programme shows a very strong commitment from the government into improving the quality and the provision of social housing. And as Dan says, the decisions we've made on the local housing allowance, which cost about £1 billion a year, mean that 1.5 million of the most vulnerable families in this country will receive on average over £600 to help them with rental payments. And additionally, next year, another £670 million for about 3 million families to help with their council tax bills of about £150 each. So we are making investments to help people with the quality of their homes. We're helping people with the affordability of those homes. And those are the right things to do. And we're also helping people get on the housing ladder as well.
1 in 10 adults in this country owns a second home, while 4 in 10 don't own their first. How does the stamp duty holiday help to address that balance?
Well, the stamp duty holiday provides obviously a holiday on stamp duty, which will help people because it reduces the cost of buying a home. But we do have a more permanent. The stamp duty holiday is temporary and will taper down after 3 months. At which point the first-time buyers benefit from a £300,000 stamp duty holiday, which means that about 80% of first-time buyers don't pay any stamp duty at all. I think it was the last stat I saw. So that is a permanent stamp duty policy in place for first-time buyers, which is very helpful. Second home buyers obviously pay a 3% surcharge when they buy a home, and that remains during the current stamp duty holidays. And there's a surcharge for second home buyers, and the new mortgage guarantee. We know from history, when we last implemented something similar after the last crisis, that 80% of the beneficiaries of that mortgage guarantee were first-time buyers. So that, I think, is good evidence that it is benefiting those who are getting on the housing ladder disproportionately to other home movers.
As you know, the proportion of first-time buyers is going down every year, and the number of young people in a position to buy is reducing every year. Prior to the stamp duty holiday, the banks were lending 95% mortgages, which disappeared after the introduction of the holiday. So really, Chancellor, you are stepping in to bail out the banks rather than first-time buyers.
No, I don't think that's right. I think you saw the same in the crisis last time. This tends to be what happens in a situation like this, that lending at that end, you saw that last time around, the products are removed as banks are prioritising and reacting to economic circumstances, which is why I think this intervention is a good one and will make a difference. We know, as I said, from previous times we've done it, it helped 100,000 people buy a home last time. The average value of a home that was bought under the scheme last time around was about £160,000 compared to the average price of a home at that time, which was more like 225. As I said, 80% first-time buyers. So it's a policy that feels like it is quite well targeted at helping people get on the housing ladder. We've done it this time around at 95% because what you saw is products have returned at lower LTVs, above kind of 85 and 90, whereas previously in the last crisis they didn't. So the guarantee started lower. There isn't the need for the guarantee at those lower levels now. So we've targeted it at the place where it can make the most difference. And I'm pleased that we work well with the banks on this, and it will be up and running in the middle of, or by the end of April, so in a few weeks' time, which is great news. So I think this will make a difference and help people.
So do you feel that the stamp duty holiday was well targeted, given that it's overwhelmingly benefited second-time property owners and landlords rather than first-time buyers?
I'm not sure that it has overwhelmingly benefited those groups. It's universal, and second home buyers have to pay an additional 3% surcharge. And remember, the motivation for the stamp duty holiday was predominantly to support the 500,000 people who are employed in and around the housing sector. And because of what had happened with lockdowns and the impact on that industry, which is quite an important part of our economy, this was a way to generate activity in that sector and to support all those jobs. So those 500,000 jobs are being supported by this intervention, and that is the reason that I think it is helpful and valuable. And you've seen that reflected on the ground in the economic activity and the jobs that it has protected. So yes, I care very much about those 500,000 jobs, and this is and construction activity completely stopped in the last time around in spring, and there were serious concerns about that. So this intervention, I think, has changed the mood on that, and as you see, there's strong activity in the housing market, which is protecting those 500,000 jobs, which is an important thing.
And if I could just add, there's also some evidence from an academic assessment of the stamp duty holiday introduced in 2008 during the financial crisis that indicated that when people move home, they typically spend around 5% of the value of the home in a period after the home move. So in terms of the kind of wider economic benefits of property transactions, there is some evidence from the last time there was such a holiday.
Yeah, my challenge to you is that if money is scarce, you should spend it where it gets most benefit to most people, to young people trying to get their first step on the property market, and to the families I see that are hugely overcrowded, who are never, ever going to get a home that is large enough for their family. But thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. And going now to Rushanara, please.
Good afternoon. So before I go on to climate change and financing net zero, I had a couple of quick fire questions following up from colleagues. Chancellor, in response to Angela Eagle's questions on the NHS, you mentioned that there's about £55 billion set aside. You promised that you would provide the NHS whatever they needed. They are saying that they're going to have to make about £8 billion worth of cuts within weeks if they don't get that money. Can you tell us if £8 billion will be made available to them at the beginning of the next financial year, yes or no?
So what I wouldn't do is comment in public about conversations that we have inside with departments to figure out exact funding requirements for next year. What I can tell you is we are providing the NHS with an enormous amount of extra resources. I don't know, Dan, if you've got the breakdown of how much we've already provided, but just at budget, we announced another £1.6 billion for the NHS for the vaccine rollout, for example. And obviously we have provided tens of billions of pounds of additional funding both over last year and this. And I think we had
I want to say it's 112 billion, but I will check.
We'll check. So, but with regard to funding for next year, whether that's with the Department of Health, Ministry for Housing, Communities, Local Government, or others, we have those conversations all the time to make sure that we can get funding to where it's needed.
So I think they'll want to know. I mean, the Red Book sets out that there's a £7 to £8 billion in the first half of 2021-22. So I think we'll all want to be assured that you'll be able to do whatever it takes to help them, so that they're not having to make cuts. Can we have that assurance at least?
As I said, I wouldn't comment on individual department conversations, but I think £407 billion of financial support for the country over last year and this year, I think would demonstrate that we are doing an enormous amount to support public services, businesses, and people through this crisis, and it stands as a very comprehensive and very significant amount of support.
So we're not going to get specifics, but I hope you manage to resolve this issue, because it's £8 billion is a lot of money, and that it will mean cuts if it's not resolved. On gender, in relation to the question my colleague Harriet asked you, the extra 19 million that's been provided to women's refuges is obviously very welcome, but Women's Aid has identified that they need 393 million. As we speak, our colleagues are speaking in the International Women's Day debate. We had International Women's Day on Monday. My colleague Jess Phillips is reading out the names of women who've been killed in the last year. And each year she has the grim task of doing that. Do you think that given that in the pandemic in the last year, the level of violence against women has gone up dramatically, do you think that this is a moment that you should be increasing the budget and providing the amount that Women's Aid has called for? And in those discussions with departments, will you consider doing that, Chancellor?
So that's why I think you're absolutely right to highlight the impact, the increase in domestic violence through the pandemic. Right? It's one of the costs of what we're doing when we talk about all the different costs of lockdowns and the difficult decisions that have to be made. You're right to highlight that this is something that has happened as a result of people being locked down. So and that's why at spending review in November we provided an extra £125 million for domestic violence to support all the ambitions in the domestic abuse bill, which supports victims and their children with safe accommodation. I think that's really important. I think that's well funded, and I believe at the time was warmly welcomed. And these extra investments will help trial and expand some new initiatives, which the evidence suggests can also make a significant impact into keeping women safe, and that's why we made those announcements as well.
Chancellor, you've heard we had a session yesterday. You've heard from Harriet about the impact on women. They've been hit very hard in this pandemic, and I've specifically highlighted the plight of women who need to be in refuges, and the supply is not as great as the need. So I just ask you to look at this in terms of the scale of what Women's Aid has spoken about, because it does feel like women's concerns are not being taken seriously enough, the impact on women in this pandemic and in terms of wider economic impacts, and not being taken seriously enough by this government. Just moving on to climate change. You amended the remit of the Monetary Policy Committee to reflect the importance of environmental sustainability and the transition to net zero, which is very welcome. So thank you for doing that. How do you hope that this will impact the MPC's decision making? And when will the remits of the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority be amended?
So it's for the Bank of England to interpret the remit, and I think they have said that they will reflect on it and publish how they think it will allow them to do things differently. So it wouldn't be right for me to comment on that.
So the only thing that I would say is I know that the governor has previously said that he's interested in how they might adjust their approach to the corporate bond purchase scheme to be some more supportive of the transition to net zero, and indeed some other central banks have a regard to sustainability and net zero outcomes for some of their interventions. But as the Chancellor says, the specifics are for the bank to interpret, but that's certainly something the governor has said in the past.
Okay, well, you may not want to answer this question, but I'll try, Chancellor. Do you approve of monetary policy being used to discourage investment in carbon? And was the change in the remit designed to give the bank cover to do so?
I'd say I can't comment on monetary policy, and as the Bank of England governor said that they'll set out their approach given the change to the updating of the remit in due course.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on in that case to the international arena. Tackling climate change requires a global response. I was born in a country that is one of the most climate vulnerable in the world, and it's likely to face some 30 million climate refugees. The UK has got a very proud record, as Harriet mentioned, of international development contribution and cross-party agreements. That's been broken by you, in fact, because of your decision to cut the aid budget. You've stated that there are reasons for that, but it literally means slashing budgets, and it will lead to people dying. And it will undermine the effort to get developing countries to make the adaptations in relation to climate change and the mitigation. So can you explain why that is justified, and does it not undermine the net zero effect and our responsibilities to developing countries that also need to work to help to reduce carbon emissions and to protect people?
Well, what I'd say, it's not a decision that we took lightly, as I said at the time, and it's about priorities, and it's about facing the most difficult fiscal and economic circumstances that I think any government or the country has faced in a very long time, and responding to it in a way that we think is both responsible for the economy but also fair. And given that, we thought it was right to prioritise resources at this difficult time on things that we've just been talking about, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's the NHS, whether it was social housing that Sean was talking about. Those are all priorities that we do have to also fund. And given we're in a difficult situation, I thought it was reasonable that we focused on those domestic priorities at this difficult time. But that doesn't mean at all that we are retrenching from being an incredibly active and generous country when it comes to supporting those who are vulnerable around the world. We will remain even at 0.5%, which is the equivalent of what we're spending this year, the second most generous G7 economy as a percentage of GDP. It will be significantly ahead of the 0.38 or 0.36% that the OECD average spends, and we will remain the largest donor to most international bodies. So whether it's things at the IMF, the World Bank, COVAX for vaccines and other things, and none of that takes into account the other things we do that are not included in the aid budget. For example, the peacekeeping operations that we conduct or the help we provide for asylum. But with regard to climate in particular, what the Foreign Secretary reiterated in his statement was that we remain committed to the same targets that we had before on international climate finance. I haven't got the numbers in my head, but I think it's a doubling of funding, and that is protected and remains an important part of what we will do to help. I just met Secretary Kerry this week to discuss that. Which is a very positive meeting, and actually we are a leader we're a leader, I think, globally with our track record on this and the example that we've set, both by our actions and by our resources, and I think others will follow. The last thing I'd say is spending money is only one way to help. Innovation is also another way. And because of what the investments we're making in R&D to catalyse new technologies, and actually showing global leadership on things like disclosures through the G7, all of that is going to enormously help as well. And the budget talked about that. It talked about the disclosures, which I'm trying to champion through the G7 and G20 this year. Talked about carbon voluntary offset markets. I think there's a whole host of things we're doing, which will make an enormous difference to countries around the world.
Some people would say slashing budgets by half in conflict zones is not going to help Britain's reputation and doesn't show a sign of leadership. So can I just ask, is this something that you expect to continue, keep the 0.5% level and enshrine it into law, or is it going to be a temporary change? Could you just clarify that?
Well, I think it can be both, because the Foreign Secretary said we'll bring forward legislation or appropriate legislation at the appropriate time. But we have also said it will be temporary, and that when the circumstances allow, we would aim to return back to the 0.7. But I think when you're talking about climate finance, this is just one of the many things we do in terms of getting funding into developing countries to help them tackle the challenges of climate change. Creating a high quality carbon offset market in the UK would also help do that. And what that will essentially do is unlock billions of private capital in developed worlds, and a well-functioning high quality market can channel that to other countries and help them do what they need to do as well. So, that's another way for us to show leadership, which will make a difference. And Clara First, who used to run the LSE, I'm delighted she's agreed to chair our working group on that, with an ambition that we make this the global leader for carbon offset trading, and that will unlock the capital that you rightly identify as needed.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rushanara. And just finally, Steve, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I refer to my registered interest in GlintPay. Chancellor, what I'd like to do today is try and enhance public understanding of where the money is coming from. Now, on Monday, I asked Richard Hughes of the OBR to comment on box 2.6 on page 57 of the Economic and Fiscal Outlook. It's all right, I'm not going to get into too much of the detail, but the point is he set out how much debt had been issued by the government, and then it then says a roughly equivalent quantity of gilts has been purchased on the secondary market by the Bank of England's asset purchase facility. So I asked Richard Hughes what the effect was. He said there were three effects. It keeps the gilt market liquid, he said. It reduces the government's borrowing costs, and it also provides a source of risk, he told us, which is that it reduces the effective maturity of government debt. Do you agree with Richard Hughes that this is the effect of QE on fiscal policy?
Yes, so Steve, sorry, what were your three were? He's right, definitely the maturity, that is absolutely right, because it has the effect of effectively doing that.
Liquidity and borrowing costs.
Keeping the market liquid, reducing borrowing costs, and maturity transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not being difficult. I'll just be careful, because obviously the exact purpose and function of QE is for the Bank of England to talk about, and in the conduct of their monetary policy operations. So I'd just be a bit cautious, but certainly.
I'm very conscious of that, and I don't want to draw you into commenting on the decisions of the Monetary Policy Committee, but I think the Governor's used words like fiscal and monetary policy are not uncorrelated. That's not a literal quote, but I think he's made the point that the two are now not uncorrelated, and I think it's important to public understanding of where we are to just drill into this a bit. So I hope you'll forgive me if I just press on.
Yeah, I think they can be, Steve, and you're absolutely right to highlight this. I don't know the exact quote, but I think it's fine for people to be acting independently, but still in a coordinated fashion. And I think that is something that provides reassurance to markets, and something that the IMF picked up on earlier on, where, if you remember, you had examples, I won't call out others, but there were examples of other jurisdictions where it felt like there wasn't a more coherent approach coming from both fiscal and monetary institutions, and that was causing market dislocation, and we were praised for having a independent but coordinated, and it gives reassurance to people that, okay, the people who are responsible for economic policy are kind of, at least talking to each other.
I can assure you that the thrust of my remarks is coherent with what you've just said, but I just need to press on, because when I think about the risks to the welfare of my constituents in Wickham, and to people across the country. I'm concerned about things like, for example, Ian Stewart, chief economist at Deloitte, told us yesterday bond markets are not terribly concerned at the moment about levels of government debt. But he also said it's also worth remembering that bond markets can change their views about fundamentals quite quickly. Now, you're experienced in these matters. Would you agree with it on both of these points?
Yeah.
That the markets are not terribly concerned right now, but also they can change their mind quite fast.
I do agree with that, and it's worth bearing in mind it's not hypothetical. I mean, it's happened just in the last 4 or 5 weeks. Right? You've seen a almost 50 basis point move in about 4 weeks, which is quite a reasonably rapid move in a short space of time, and that is he's absolutely right. I mean, that's perfectly possible.
Now, the chief executive of the Debt Management Office, Sir Robert Stayman, made some remarks to the Times on the 30th, reported on the 30th of April. And I should say the remarks he slightly played down when he came to the committee. But he said, we were very lucky to get away with that auction. A few hours later, and we could have had an uncovered auction. He went on, my worry is the ability to carry out my mandate to raise the funds that the government needs. There was that bad period in March, March 2020, where my worry was that liquidity would not be there. The bank's actions were critical to fixing that. Do you recognise those remarks and that phenomenon?
I can't remember his exact remarks, but I mean, he's right that there was acute disruption. I mean, there was some disruption in gilt market, or not just the UK. I think globally there was a week. I'm trying to remember when it was. It was in March. There was a period of volatility, and that's what I was talking about before. People wanting to know that there was a kind of joined up approach from economic institutions. So that was a period of volatility in gilt markets for a very short period of time. But I don't think we were alone in experiencing that. From memory, it was global in nature as well.
He also went on, speaking of the gilt markets, he said, it has got used to the notion that there is one large seller in the primary market, asked the Debt Management Office, and in the secondary market, there is one very large source of demand, the bank. That has established an equilibrium that has given market makers the confidence that it is now a safe market in which to operate. But does this not go some way, bearing in mind Richard Hughes' comments about the liquidity of the market, does this not go some way to explaining why the markets are not too concerned about the level of government debt right now? It's because of the level of QE right now.
Obviously that's a question for sovereign debt purchases, but I mean, just the numbers speak for themselves. And as Richard Hughes and you said, there's been a very significant amount of purchases by the Bank of England on the primary market this year. They have outlined their view to, they've outlined the quantum and the pace, I think, going forward. Our financing needs, as are identified in the Red Book, you will be able to see those for the next few years. They're significant, and that's why I thought it is a responsible thing to do to make sure our public finances are returned to a more sustainable position. Because you're absolutely right, Steve. We have to finance the spending that we can't finance through taxes, and bond markets, charge us a price for that. And as we've been discussing, that price can change, and that has now a reasonably significant impact on our borrowing costs.
I have to say, I'm not trying to catch you out here. I'm trying to make the point in the public debate that this is a very serious situation. Because also the Telegraph recently had an article by Matthew Lynn on 10th of March yesterday, referring to the OECD's economic outlook, starting to say now that some signs of inflation have begun to emerge. So I just want to turn to an exchange we had at length with the Bank of England on the 20th of May. I mean, I won't get into too much of it, but the governor at the end of it, the conclusion of my exchange, the governor said to me of the bank, we have no objective to make sure all gilt auctions succeed. If a gilt auction fails, a gilt auction fails. It's not part of the objective of the Bank of England to make all gilt auctions succeed. And I know you would recognise that. But the point I really want to ask you about is that Jan Vleger said this. He said, if we were the central bank of the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe, his words, not mine, the mechanical transactions on our balance sheet would be similar to what is actually happening in the UK right now. End quote. Now, the point he was making, and I'm very clear about this, and the bank were very clear about it, was that it's the independence of the Monetary Policy Committee that enables them to conduct monetary policy at the scale that they are, with the consequences for the bond market. So I've really got two questions for you. The first is, I think, quite straightforward. As Chancellor, as the person who hands them their mandate, will you commit to maintaining the Bank of England's independence in pursuing price stability, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Because the concern...
Already done, Steve, because we've got the mandate is published, but yes. And you are absolutely right to highlight the importance of independence. I couldn't agree more.
I think we're all agreed, but this is the problem. This is my final point. The thing that keeps me awake at night is that I worry that if inflation were only to get up, and I appreciate it's a challenge raising it at all at the moment, but if it were only to get up to say 5 or 6%, only 5 or 6%, the Bank of England have been very clear with us, and you're clear with us, that they independently must pursue price stability. And so even at relatively low levels of inflation in single digits, they presumably would be looking at tapering off QE and possibly raising interest rates. And elsewhere, we've talked about the effect that would likely have on the bond markets. Can I just ask you what your reflections are on the fiscal consequences for the UK of that scenario, and to what extent are you concerned about it?
I think that brings us right back to the beginning with the chair's question, and I think you've articulated the risks very well. So I'm not sure there's much I can add, but you're right to highlight the sensitivity of our fiscal situation to changes in inflation and interest rates. And you are right that the bank has an independent, rightly so, remit to focus on price stability. And as they do that as interest rates change, that has implications for the public finances.
Chancellor, thank you very much. You'll certainly have my support as you seek to do responsible things with the public finances.
Thank you, Steve.
Steve, thank you very much. And that does bring us to the end of this evidence session. So, Chancellor, could I thank you very much indeed for appearing before us and answering our questions this afternoon, and also to thank Dan for your contribution as well. There are a wide range of issues that we've discussed today, and I think it's fair to say there are some areas of agreement and inevitably some of quite strong disagreement. But what I think we can all agree upon is these are unprecedented times, certainly some of the most challenging outside of wartime. We don't envy you the hand that you have been dealt, and I think I speak for the whole committee when I say, for the sake of our country, we hope that you take the right decisions going forward and that you successfully meet the challenges that you face. And at that point, I am going to conclude this session. Order. Great.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Committee Room 15, sound. Committee Room 15, sound.